Hello, vintage outboard motor fans. This is TMI here on Toledo Bend Lake. Making another video today. Today's video is going to be on parts. Parts for your vintage outboard motors and the difference between OEM and aftermarket parts. Okay, so it's going to be a 4-part video. All right. First part is going to be on the definition. What is the definition of OEM and aftermarket? And then the second part is going to be the pros and cons of each one. Okay, and the third part is going to be your vintage outboard motors and OEM and aftermarket parts and how that affects you and I on how we work on our vintage outboard motors. And then the fourth part is going to be called Made in China. We're going to talk about these parts that are made in China. All right, so if everybody's ready, here we go. Okay, so in my quest for knowing everything you can know about vintage outboard motors, Johnson and Evinrude's 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, 3 horsepower to 20 horsepower, I have decided to dig in deep on parts. So getting parts for these motors is a big deal. Finding the parts, I solved that issue a couple years ago. I know where to find different kind of parts. Now, I've decided to start selling these parts to you guys. So I wanted to make sure I knew all the ins and outs of it, and found out that we really need to study the difference between OEM and aftermarket parts for these vintage outboard motors. So here we go with part one. Part one is the definition. All right. The definition of OEM parts are what the initials stand for: original equipment manufacturer. So Johnson made parts for Johnson, Evinrude made parts for Evinrude. They joined together, they became OMC, they made parts. All right. So that's the original equipment manufacturer. Then there's also aftermarket parts. Okay, so aftermarket parts are parts that are made by a third party. All right, so Honda may build a car and use a third party to make their parts. That's called an aftermarket part brought in for their car. Same thing for vintage outboard motors. So that's the two different kinds of parts: OEM and aftermarket. All right. So now let's move to part two: the pros and cons of the two different kinds. All right, first let's take the OEM parts. The pros of the OEM parts are quality. So the original equipment manufacturer makes their parts, they have their brand on it, they want it to look the best and be the best part that's out there, so normally they are. All right, the cons of OEM parts are cost. Normally they cost more than the aftermarket parts, rightly so, because of quality. All right, and then the other con is availability, especially in the case of our vintage motors. Finding these parts from OEM, original equipment manufacturers, is not that easy, so we may have to go to aftermarket parts. All right, so now the pros and cons of aftermarket parts. It's exactly the opposite. All right, the pros, of course, is the availability. Everybody wants to make the aftermarket parts for these outboard motors. Okay, so there's a lot of them out there, a lot of availability. The other pro is the cost. They're competing against each other to sell you these parts, so the cost is lower, so that's a good thing. All right. Of course, the con is the quality. The quality of these aftermarket parts, and we're going to talk about that in part 4, Made in China. All right, so that's part 2. Now we'll move to part 3, and where it affects you and I on our vintage outboard motors. All right, the OEM and the aftermarket. So in my case, Johnson and Evinrude's, I specifically work on those. So the original parts, of course, are hard to find. You have to get used parts. I have an eBay store, and I sell the used parts on there. When it comes to the kits, the seals, and things like that, I found that Sierra, all right, Sierra is a manufacturer of these parts. I consider them to be OEM for Johnson and Evinrude OMC. They're not aftermarket. I don't think so. I think they're the original manufacturers that came to play with OMC, and they sell Mercury and other parts too, but I recommend Sierra parts. All right, so that's how the OEM and aftermarket part affects us. So now let's move to the fun part. Part 4, made in China. So I buy my parts on eBay. I'm an eBay seller. I sell all these parts, the carb kits, the coils, points condensers, fuel conversions. I have the listings, the links down below for all these parts. So I buy my parts off of eBay. And for example of the difference between made in China and OEM or aftermarket made here, we're going to look at carburetors. So here's a carburetor kit made by Sierra. All right, this is a 18-7043 carb kit. See, it says Sierra on the listing. All right, so here's the same kit that's made in China. All right, so look at the difference. Supposedly the same parts. So if you get on eBay and you look for this part number 18-7043, you're going to find different listings. All right, this listing looks like this. They take the parts and they spread them all out on the table and take a picture of them. You can't see the packaging, you can't see the labeling. They call it a Johnson & Evinrude 18-7043, made in China. It's trash. The gaskets literally dissolve when they hit the gas. The main jet doesn't fit into the main jet receptacle on the carburetor. Trash. If you get on eBay and you see these listings for these carb kits and you don't see this listing that shows the packaging, that shows Sierra on it, don't buy it. Do not buy these off of eBay. They are trash. Buy these. Pay a little more. OEM parts. Sierra makes all the gaskets, gear case kits, all the parts, coils, points, condensers. These are the parts that I buy, that I resell to you and have videos on how to do them. All right, so that's the part 4, made in China. I don't like the China parts. I like the Sierra parts. All right, so in summary, we talked about the definition of OEM and aftermarket. We talked about the pros and cons of each. Then we talked about how those OEM and aftermarket parts affect the vintage motor world that we live in. And then we talked about the made in China parts. Don't like them. All right, so hopefully these 4 parts will help clear up the world of parts as it comes to vintage outboard motor parts. If you have any questions, just let me know. Hit the subscribe button down below and go to my eBay store and find all these OEM Sierra parts that you need. All right, so I hope you enjoyed the video. I know I did. See y'all next time. Well, thanks for watching the video. I'd like to take this time to share with you some of the offerings that I have here at TMI's Vintage Outboards. The first thing is my eBay store. I have over 2,000 parts in my eBay store, almost anything you need for your vintage outboard motors. Johnson & Evinrude, 1950s and 60s, 20 horsepower and less. Have the link to my eBay store and all of these services down below in the description. Second thing is technical consulting. I offer technical consulting to help with your outboards, $40 an hour. Just buy one of these and you get an hour's worth of consulting. If it's 5 or 10 minutes of a question or two and you want to call me, it's free. Just call me. My phone number is 337-278-5429. I answer my phone all the time. All right. Next thing I do is I started selling kits for your motors. I have a master tune-up kit for doing your ignition magnetos. I have the coils, points and condensers, spark plug wire, spark plugs, and I also sell all of these parts individually. All right. Next thing I started offering now is fuel pump conversion kits. the FPCs to upgrade from a dual line to a single line. Offer a kit for the 7.5s, for the 10 horsepowers, and for the 15 and 18 horsepowers. All right. The next thing I do is I service, repair, and restore. I've done over 130 full restores. I do a light restore for $9.50. I do a full restore for $12.50, and I do service and repair work for $40 an hour plus parts. All right. And also I have T-Mic caps and mouse pads for sale. All right, join the TMI Club and buy you some of these. So the links for all this are down below. And also I have over 280 videos now on everything you need to know. If you come up with something that you find I don't have a video for, just hit me up on this channel or on my phone number, and I'll try to do it for you. Thanks so much, and remember, always remember, and never forget, we're doing it one motor at a time.